States to divide and rule.
I'm Greg Wilpert, coming to you from Quito.
Okay, we are live now, and we're going to be discussing a little bit more about the topic of South America and leftism basically collapsing there. We're going to go through it in very, really brief summary today. There's basically this story now that UNASUR, which is a regional organization in South America, is collapsing due to the rise of right-wing governments in Latin America. Now, at this moment over here, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to actually go through this a different time too, but here is what he says. This is the foreign minister of Ecuador talking to the Venezuelan ambassador to Ecuador's husband, who is Gregory Wilpert. You'll see him right over here. And this is what he says about UNASUR on the Real News.
Against each other. This process of kind of competing against each other in race to the bottom.
Wrong moment for this to happen. Might end up doing this a different day, by the way. This was kind of a last minute prospect. It's already not going well.
It's the Real News Network.
Raw materials and compete against each other. This process of kind of competing against each other in race to the bottom is bad economically, and it's bad in terms of sovereignty. It means we're more vulnerable, and it's easier for great powers like the United States to divide and rule. So
Guillaume Long, who is the gentleman in the photo, who actually, he was the foreign minister of Ecuador under the previous president, Rafael Correa, is basically lamenting the disintegration of UNASUR, which was supposed to be the European Union of South America. Now, to be fair, and again, we're going to have to go through this in very, very short form. South America has a little more in common between its constituent states than Europe does, because most of the continent speaks either Spanish or Portuguese, and they do have some common cultural issues. But the truth is that in northern South America, or let's say the Andean South America, there's a much higher indigenous population than in southern South America, which is Argentina, where it's mostly, European immigrants from Italy, Germany, and other countries, and Spain, of course. So at the end of this, he basically goes on to say that it will actually undermine the sovereignty of the continent as a whole, because they will be giving more and more power to the actual constituent states. I think my mouse just died. No, here we go. Whoops. Here we go. So yes, I mean, Ecuador is now one of the countries that is going against UNASUR, endangering UNASUR. The one thing I like about the Real News is that they transcript almost every one of their stories. Maybe it's not a coincidence that this happened just a few days after Vice President Pence's visit to Quito. There's clearly a whole agenda of moving away from a progressive foreign policy to a much more kind of, sort of traditional inter-American bond with the United States. Top-down sort of traditional Latin American relationship with the United States and right-wing prerogatives in terms of foreign policy. So I think it's very sad, and I think it's very important that the people of UNASUR fight for that legacy, the huge strategic importance of UNASUR to overcome the, normal changes and shifts that happen in countries' politics. Do you understand what that means? Effectively, their dream of UNASUR was that it would be a transnational body that would be a United States of South America, and that federal structure, which would be essentially located, I think it was in Cochabamba in Bolivia. Yes, I know a lot of you will probably think, oh, that's a funny name, but it's a pretty significant, I think it was looked at as, one second. I don't need that. So They were supposed to have a South American parliament there. And this is just one of several attempts at regionalism. They're going to have their secretariat, or which would be basically the same as Brussels over in Europe, which is the executive branch of the European Union with all the bureaucracy. And they're going to have a parliament over in Bolivia. But effectively, everybody knows that the European Union, the parliament is virtually, it has virtually no power. Sometimes they have a little effect as an advisory body on the laws there. So then, they were hoping to form basically a continental bloc. And at the moment, you see here that Peru, Colombia, I believe Paraguay, and Argentina, as well as Brazil, have all suspended their membership in UNASUR. Okay, and essentially what this will mean is that UNASUR is effectively a dream, because for one thing, Bolivia is now again landlocked by states that don't participate. I forgot to say Chile, by the way, but that's what I'm talking about. That this guy was hoping. People like, let me show him on screen again, Guillaume Long, they were hoping that basically you could form this progressive United States of South America that would overrule the democratically elected governments of the local, states that we know now, the independent states, Uruguay, Brazil, Venezuela, let's say, Colombia. And that, in my opinion, it's one of the most hypocritical things you could get, because what did they say about Europe? It says this is from 2016, the European revolt against the neoliberal EU, and it says what started off as a financial crisis in Europe has now turned and become a crisis of the Eurozone. There has been unprecedented waves of mass strikes, signifying the discontent of the working classes. In Greece, for example, people elected the Leftist Syriza party and voted no to the austerity debt deal offered to them by the Troika. In France, there has been consistent strikes against efforts to reverse labor rights by the so-called socialist government. Well, after the socialist government in France, they elected Emmanuel Macron, he's definitely no socialist. Among other developments in Portugal, the people elected a socialist party which vowed to curb EU austerity. In the UK, they voted for Brexit. Some claim that this was due to the anti-democratic neoliberal structures of the European Union. So what exactly are the limits of the European project, and how does the left seize the moment to build a popular movement of the left across the continent? So what these people actually have an opposition to is not the dictatorial nature of the EU or any multinational body that it tries to impose power from the top to the bottom. They would love for the EU to continue, but as a much more far left controlling body. They have no problem with that. They just want it to be much more of an equal distribution of wealth across the continent. But they don't realize that there's different strengths and tendencies of parts of the European continent, probably much more so than in South America. The priorities of the people in Greece are not necessarily those of the people in Amsterdam, which is in the Netherlands. They're not necessarily the priorities of the people in Poland. They're not the priorities of the people in Sweden, which I'm not sure if Sweden is even in the EU. They might be in the EFTA. So essentially, you're seeing an erosion of Europe due to the executive control, basically concentrating more and more power at the top. And in the European Union, it was in unelected bodies. How are you supposed to elect bodies in South America? It's hard enough now to keep these officials accountable in their separate countries. You have a lot of these leftists. They're trying to get, and we'll be discussing it either next week or the week after that. Raven Starkiller, I need you to get in touch with me. We're going to be discussing what's happening in Brazil, where 2 former presidents have been indicted or convicted. And the left is trying to get them released from prison, even though there's overwhelming evidence that they were complicit in some of the worst financial scandals in the history of the country. So there is no desire for complicity and transparency here, because what he actually says, and once again, he says, I think it's very important that the people of UNASUR fight for that legacy, the huge strategic importance of UNASUR to overcome the, normal changes and shifts that happen in countries' politics. He wants there to be a central authority in South America, in Cochabamba and in Quito, Ecuador. Cochabamba is in Bolivia. He wants there to be a central authority to override the will of democratic elections, including, and by the way, he goes in and starts laying into CONAIE, which is an indigenous movement in Ecuador. These Ecuadorian Indian tribes that basically have rejected the latest socialist governments. At one point, they were allies of the socialist government. What happened? Well, in their eyes, it's the Indians' fault that the socialist government did not come through for them. That the socialist government is now basically renouncing its former leader and pretty much drifting away, maybe later drifting away from socialism. So I will discuss some of these events later, probably next week. Try to go through it in much more detail. But for now, please chew on some of these articles and especially the videos. The articles I'll try to update later. I do have to run. And again, what's the choice here is between control at the local level and control at a level that you can't reach. If your country is basically subjugated by a multinational body that is holding your country ransom in order to basically concentrate power at the top, it doesn't matter what flag it flies. It doesn't matter whether it's the right or the left. It's basically a charade. Please like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below.